Let's cut to it. You went no contact, and now you're wondering what's going on in their head, especially if they're avoidant. Are they relieved? Do they miss you? Are they even thinking about you? Listen, this isn't about playing games. This is about getting real with what avoidants actually hope for when you finally walk away. Because it's not what you think. This is going to be uncomfortable. It's going to challenge your assumptions. But if you're willing to sit with the truth, it just might set you free. Let's talk about what avoidants really want when you go no contact and why that matters more for you than it ever did for them. When you go no contact with an avoidant, the first thing to understand is that emotional distance feels like safety to them. It's not necessarily that they don't care. It's that closeness, real emotional intimacy, triggers something deep inside that feels unsafe. So when the connection gets intense, when the emotions rise, when things start to feel vulnerable, an avoidant's natural instinct is to pull back. Not because you did something wrong, but because closeness stirs up fears they've often carried since childhood. Fears of being engulfed, controlled, or losing themselves in someone else's needs. Avoidants are often people who grew up in environments where emotional expression wasn't modeled or welcomed. They may have learned to suppress their feelings or to depend only on themselves. Vulnerability wasn't rewarded. It may have been punished, ignored, or used against them. So they developed a survival strategy. Protect yourself by keeping others at a distance. That way you can't get hurt. That strategy gets hardwired into adulthood, showing up in romantic relationships as detachment, coolness, or sudden withdrawal. So when you go no contact, what's happening on their side? Ironically, it can actually bring a kind of relief. Not necessarily because they wanted you gone, but because the emotional intensity of the relationship has been dialed down. The pressure is off. They're no longer being asked to show up in a way that scares them. They're no longer being asked to meet someone in emotional spaces they don't feel equipped to navigate. The silence, the distance, it actually feels familiar. It's a return to the emotional normal they know best. But don't mistake that relief for indifference. It's not black and white. Avoidance may still think about you, still miss aspects of the connection, still feel the sting of loss. But they often don't know how to process that in a healthy way. Instead of feeling their emotions and leaning into them, they compartmentalize, they distract, they push thoughts of you aside because that feels easier than facing the discomfort that true emotional processing would bring. For them, avoidance isn't just a behavior. It's an internal survival mechanism. Now here's the twist. That emotional distance they feel in no contact, it's also what allows them to idealize the relationship. With space, they're more likely to focus on the good moments, the comfort, the laughs, the connection. Because now it's not threatening. It's safe to remember you when you're not right there asking for something they don't know how to give. So sometimes no contact actually increases the emotional charge for an avoidant, but they don't respond the way you might expect. They don't reach out. They don't pour their heart out. They sit with it quietly or bury it and continue on. And this is why emotional distance feels safe. It gives them control. Control over how much they feel, how much they show, how much risk they take. And when you remove yourself from the picture, you've unknowingly made it easier for them to feel something without the risk of emotional exposure. It's complicated, it's layered, and it rarely looks like grief or heartbreak from the outside. But make no mistake, just because it doesn't look loud doesn't mean it's not there. Understanding this is not about excusing their behavior. It's about clarity, about seeing the internal world of someone who's wired differently. And that clarity, that's power. Because when you stop personalizing their silence, you start reclaiming your own peace. Avoidants have a deep, often unspoken desire to be seen, accepted, and even loved, but without having to expose their vulnerabilities. That might sound contradictory, but it's one of the core internal conflicts of avoidant attachment. What they really want is validation without they want to feel valued, desired, and important to someone. But they don't want to open themselves up emotionally to receive it. When you go no contact, especially if it's after a period of tension or emotional pursuit, it can actually trigger a hidden hope in the avoidant that you'll still think about them, miss them, want them, without them having to do anything emotionally uncomfortable to maintain the connection. In their ideal world, you still care, you still ache for them, you still wait, but from a distance, they hope to be validated without being required to meet you emotionally. They want the reassurance of your affection without the obligation of intimacy. This plays out in subtle and not so subtle ways. For example, they might silently monitor you on social media, not to re-engage, but to confirm that you're still thinking about them, posting things they can read into, showing signs of sadness or longing. They might avoid blocking you, not because they want to reconcile, but because blocking you would cut off their invisible thread of validation. As long as they can see you miss them without having to respond, they get what they crave: emotional affirmation without emotional risk. At the heart of this is the fear of vulnerability. Vulnerability means admitting you care, that you need someone, that you're affected. And for avoidance, that level of openness feels dangerous. It feels like giving someone power over them. So instead, they pull back when things get too real, but they still secretly want to be wanted. They want you to chase them, to wonder about them, to keep the emotional connection alive on your side. It's not malicious, it's protective. It's the way they learn to get some of their needs met without having to go all in emotionally. This is why avoidants often don't fully disengage after a breakup. They linger, they send a vague message weeks later, they accidentally like an old post. These are not random acts. These are subtle ways of checking, do I still matter to you? But again, they want the answer without having to risk hearing no. They want to be validated by your reaction without opening themselves up to rejection or disappointment. Even in their silence, they're often hoping you'll break first, that you'll be the one to reach out, that you'll extend the olive branch, not because they want to repair things, but because it reassures them that they haven't been abandoned. For an avoidant, being needed can feel safer than needing someone else. So your outreach becomes their comfort, not because they'll respond with depth or clarity, but because it calms their internal fear of emotional insignificance. But here's the truth. This pattern traps both people. It keeps the avoidant in a loop where they never have to grow emotionally, and it keeps you in a loop where your worth is tied to someone else's reaction. That's why understanding this dynamic is so important. Because once you realize what they're hoping for, validation without vulnerability, you can step out of that trap. You stop playing the silent emotional tug of war. You start focusing on your own healing instead of manning their discomfort. And that's the turning point. Because your silence, your distance, your choice not to feed their need for validation, it forces them to confront something they spend their whole life avoiding themselves. One of the most misunderstood things about avoidantly attached people is how deeply they rely on fantasy over reality when it comes to relationships. This isn't about daydreaming in a romantic way. It's about mentally constructing a version of the relationship and even of you that feels safer than what actually existed. Avoidants often struggle with the day-to-day emotional demands of intimacy, but that doesn't mean they don't think about love or long for connection. What they do instead is idealize relationships at a distance and criticize them up close. When you're physically present and emotions start to get real, when you need closeness, reassurance, vulnerability, they begin to feel overwhelmed or cornered. It activates their fear of being engulfed or losing control. So they back off, they detach, and often they start to devalue you or the relationship. That's a defense mechanism. If they convince themselves that something was too much, too needy, or not quite right, then they can justify the withdrawal without having to face their own discomfort with closeness. But here's where it gets more complicated. Once you go no contact, the emotional intensity of the relationship drops. You're no longer calling, texting, asking questions, expressing feelings, and that emotional space gives the avoidant room to mentally reconstruct the relationship in a way that feels manageable to them. Suddenly, the parts that felt threatening when you were close, your emotional needs, your bids for connection, are no longer in front of them. So their perception softens. They might start to miss you, but they miss a version of you, not the real, complex, emotionally present person you. They miss the idea of connection without the pressure of showing up for it. This is what it means to favor fantasy over reality. They start to remember the good times, the easy moments, the chemistry. They idealize the connection when it's out of reach, and they diminish it when it's available. It's not that they're manipulative. It's that closeness activates fear and distance allows romanticism. It's easier for them to long for something they don't have to emotionally invest in. And this cycle can repeat endlessly unless it's interrupted by real self-awareness and growth. This pattern explains why some avoidants suddenly reappear after weeks or months of silence. You've been out of contact, and in that time, their brain has filtered out the emotional tension and exaggerated the highlights. They may convince themselves that they want another shot, but often once things become real again and the emotional stakes rise, they repeat the same behavior. They pull away. Not because they lied or didn't care, but because the fantasy felt safer than the reality. And if you're on the other side of this dynamic, it's incredibly confusing. You feel discarded, then idealized, then discarded again. It makes you question your worth. But the truth is, this push-pull isn't about your value, it's about their emotional limits. It's about their difficulty tolerating the vulnerability that comes with real love, real intimacy, real human connection. Understanding this helps you detach, not just physically, but emotionally. You stop taking their shifts in affection so personally. You stop mistaking their silence for certainty or their absence for peace. You start to see that they may be stuck in a pattern that has nothing to do with how lovable or worthy you are and everything to do with how safe they feel within themselves. Fantasy gives avoidance control. Reality demands presence. And when you go no contact, they cling to the version of you they can control. The one that lives in memory, not the one that challenges them to grow. Control is everything to someone with an avoidant attachment style. It's not about being domineering or manipulative in the classic sense. It's about emotional safety. Deep down, avoidants fear being overwhelmed, engulfed, or losing themselves in a relationship. So when they sense that closeness is beginning to require more emotional exposure than they're comfortable with, they retreat. And one of the most powerful ways they exert control in these situations is through silence. When you go no contact, or when they do, that silence becomes a tool, not always consciously, but deeply rooted in how they manage discomfort. Avoidants often struggle to communicate their feelings directly, expressing vulnerability, admitting fear, asking for space, or even saying, "I miss you," can feel like too much. Instead, they shut down. They retreat into themselves. Their silence isn't just avoidance. It's a method of staying in control. In silence, they don't have to deal with your emotions. They don't have to explain theirs. They don't risk saying something wrong or being misunderstood. They stay hidden, which to them feels safer than being exposed. But here's the twist. Silence isn't just for self-protection. It also functions as a form of emotional power. When you reach out and they don't respond, they control the tempo. When you wonder what they're thinking, why they're quiet, whether they're hurt or angry or indifferent, they remain in the driver's seat. Your emotional world becomes focused on their absence, and in that absence, they gain the upper hand. Again, not necessarily in a malicious way, but as a subconscious defense mechanism. It allows them to dictate the boundaries of the relationship without having to negotiate them with you. Silence also protects them from emotional accountability. As long as they don't engage, they don't have to clarify their role in what went wrong. They don't have to deal with conflict or confront their own avoidance. They can frame the breakup or the distance however they need to in their mind to justify their behavior. Silence gives them the illusion that they can move on without facing uncomfortable truths. And in some cases, it allows them to fantasize that if they ever did return, things could just pick up where they left off on their terms. This dynamic can be incredibly disorienting for the person on the receiving end. When someone suddenly goes silent, especially after intense emotional moments, it can trigger deep insecurity and confusion. You may find yourself trying to interpret their lack of response, replaying every word and action, wondering if you pushed too hard or if they ever cared at all. But that's the trap. While you're stuck in emotional overdrive, they've checked out, and in doing so, they've avoided both the relationship and the consequences of their emotional withdrawal. And yet, silence often masks a storm. Just because they're not speaking doesn't mean they're at peace. Avoidants often feel deeply, but don't have the tools or the emotional language to express what they're going through. So they sit with it. They suppress. They distract. They convince themselves that distance equals resolution, when in reality, it's only postponement. But because they've learned that vulnerability leads to discomfort, not connection, they stick with what they know: silence and control. The most powerful realization is this: their silence is about them, not you. It's a protective strategy, not a statement of your worth. When you stop trying to decode the silence and start seeing it as a coping mechanism, you begin to reclaim your own emotional power. You stop trying to manage their discomfort and start focusing on your own clarity. Control through silence may work for them temporarily, but your growth begins the moment you stop letting that silence define your value. When you go no contact with an avoidant, one of the most surprising truths is this: deep down, many of them hope you'll be the one to reach out first. It might seem like they're done with you. They might look calm, detached, even indifferent. But underneath that cool surface, avoidants often carry a quiet hope that you'll break the silence. Not so they can repair the relationship necessarily, but so they can feel wanted again without having to risk vulnerability themselves. Avoidants struggle with emotional closeness. They crave connection, but when it starts to feel too intimate or emotionally demanding, they back away. They feel safer when they have distance, when emotions aren't too intense, when expectations aren't high, when they don't feel like they have to give more than they're comfortable with. So when you finally walk away and go no contact, it creates a paradox for them. On one hand, it brings relief. The pressure is gone. They no longer have to manage someone else's emotions or confront their own discomfort. But on the other hand, the silence can stir up a different kind of fear, the fear of being forgotten. Avoidants don't want to be emotionally responsible, but they do want to feel emotionally significant. This means they often want to know that you still care, that you still think about them, that you still miss them. That desire for significance is real, but they want it without the cost of emotional vulnerability. So they often sit back and hope you'll make the first move. That way they don't have to face rejection, they don't have to be vulnerable, and they don't have to explain themselves. You breaking no contact reassures them that they still matter, that they're still in control, and that you're still emotionally available, without them needing to risk anything. They may not reach out, because reaching out would require them to acknowledge their own feelings. It would require them to be open to rejection or emotional conversation. So instead they wait. They watch. They drop subtle signs, an old photo liked on social media, a vague message, a passive status update. These low-effort actions are often designed to trigger a response from you. If you reach out, it confirms what they hoped, that the door is still open, that they still have an emotional hold on you, that they don't have to risk vulnerability to get reassurance. It's a form of emotional outsourcing. They rely on you to do the emotional work, to bridge the gap, to manage the connection. And when you do, it validates them, but it often doesn't change their behavior. In fact, it can reinforce their avoidant tendencies. They learn that they can pull away and still receive love or attention without having to engage in emotional depth. This can lead to a toxic cycle where you do all the reaching, all the fixing, and they remain emotionally distant while still reaping the benefits of your emotional labor. But when you don't reach out, when you maintain no contact and focus on your healing, it forces a shift. The avoidant no longer has the reassurance of your presence. They're left with the consequences of their detachment. For some, this can be a wake-up call. For others, it triggers more avoidance. But either way, your silence creates a space where you are no longer emotionally available on their terms. The hard truth is this: avoidants often want to be chased, not because they're cruel, but because it allows them to feel wanted without having to confront the parts of themselves that fear real closeness. When you refuse to chase, you stop feeding that dynamic. And that's when your healing begins, not by making them change, but by choosing not to participate in a cycle that constantly costs you your peace. So here's the truth, laid bare. Avoidants don't stop caring just because they stop communicating. But caring isn't the same as connecting, and connection takes courage. They often haven't built yet. When you go no contact, they may feel relief, hope for your attention, fantasize about the best parts, and cling to the silence like armor. But none of that is love in action. None of that builds a relationship that can actually grow. What they hope for is comfort without confrontation, validation, without vulnerability, closeness without cost. And if you've been caught in that loop, let this be your turning point. You are not here to be someone's emotional placeholder. You are not here to chase, to fix, or to wait for someone who only wants you when you're far enough away to feel safe. No contact isn't about revenge. It's about recovery. It's your boundary. It's your clarity. And in that space, you finally get to see the truth, not just about them, but about you, about what you deserve, about how love should feel when it's real. So stop wondering if they'll come back. Start asking if you would ever go back to someone who only loved you comfortably from a distance. You didn't lose them. You found yourself. Keep going.